Good afternoon. I am going to speak with you today about the industry side of multidisciplinary, multi-institutional collaborations. When Brad and Kendra asked me to do this, I thought, well, why me? I don't have any a whole lot to offer here. But it took me probably 10 minutes to think about all of the issues that we have had to work through as we put together or go through projects involving multiple groups. What I'm going to talk with you about is going to be a little more focused. So as you heard about the Norcore project, what I'm going to talk about will be more lessons learned in smaller scope projects that will hit on some of the disciplines, some of the best practices that ultimately we have learned as we've gone through projects. These are the kinds of things that, unfortunately, as scientists, at least when I went to school, nobody taught that. We all focused very heavily on the science, on the technical side, and then even earlier or mid-career, we still didn't get a whole lot of education as far as that's concerned. But more and more, I think what's happening is the institutions and companies are beginning to teach these best practices. So hopefully, some of what I'll share with you will help you as you go through, on the industry side anyway, putting together project teams and managing projects. I was asked to do a disclosure slide, so this is my disclosure. I do work for Luprino Foods. I also work with the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, contribute to FSBCA and ILSI North America. I do not speak for any of those entities. And examples, I have a few examples, are being used with permission. So with that, I'll launch right into what I'll talk about. So my outline, like I said, this is going to be very focused. I'll talk about industry food safety projects and approaches. And then I'll talk about project team selection and dynamics. And you heard a little bit about that from the last speaker. Typical challenges that we face with broad project challenges. And then some strategies that we have learned for successful deployment. So food safety projects on the industry side tend to be more embedded in other company initiatives. So the stimulus might be a new process or a value engineered process, new ingredient or ingredient substitution because of scarcity or whatever. It may be equipment related, new equipment, a rebuild or repurposed piece of equipment that is going to be put in production. Customer changes end use of a product or this handling in the field that is different. Sometimes projects are more plant productivity type projects, or often there is a regulatory requirement that we have to comply with, so we have to figure out what it is we need to do in the process. The types of processes you can see there that we launch as part of the food safety side of chemicals removal, for example, pathogen deactivation, or preventing growth or limiting growth. Often you find things like extended runs. So as part of plant productivity, production wants to run longer than what they typically run, and there is a food safety component there. Or shelf life determination. It could even be part of an analytical method development or validation, or new sanitation protocol. One of the ones, at least in dairy anyway, we spent a lot of time revisiting is clean break determination as related to sanitation. So the approaches that we take pretty much when we're scoping out a project, if it's a small scope project, generally it's wholly internal. So we're just using company resources, and it may be a bunch of different departments that are working together on the project. Or it could be one that we wholly outsource to either a research firm or an academic institution. Or sometimes it's a third-party expert that is going to be carrying out the project. Some of the ones that take a lot of management are going to be ones where we're collaborating with suppliers, buyers or customers, or they involve multiple facilities owned by the same enterprise, or sometimes a co-manufacturer that's going to be producing a branded product for a company. One of the ones, and I think the first speaker spoke about that is becoming more common now, are these pre-competitive type food safety projects where you're working along with a bunch of cohort companies that are funding research to solve a problem, or at least get some information that's going to be actionable. So, for example, the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy has a Listeria Research Consortium that has been funding research, some on basically understanding the organism. A lot of it is around biofilm or prevention of growth or elimination. As you can see, as you bring in more and more players or different institutions, the complexity kind of goes up. So there are more entities to manage, all with their different personalities and different quirks. Within the context of FSMA, when we're talking about innovation, where food safety is embedded, we're having to consider a lot of different aspects. So manufacturing, the unit operations, validation of process, and understanding the process and its capability, allergens, shelf life type considerations, and market considerations. So FSMA layers on additional requirements. So with those in mind, then, you have to look at, okay, how do you go about putting together an innovation process? This is something R&D folks have been doing for years and years. And not done right, you find yourself looking at testing and validation sometimes after launch. But really, from a food safety standpoint, this is really where you want to now embed your food safety project, so we better understand what this product or process is going to do and where we have to pay attention to controls. It also means then that it's not just the R&D group that is working on the project, but now you've got all of the other players that are going to help with validation and testing. Don't really want to talk about dirty laundry, but within industry, we have some traditional, natural tensions. If you look at what it is that we have to do, and all of the different players, they're naturally tensions that exist between these different departments. Certainly, marketing wants to go from A to Z and have the product in market like yesterday, because they have a deadline or they have sales forecasts against that. You've got the accounting people that are already counting the dollars, the productivity and savings that ideally is going to be delivered. You've got certainly operations folks whose really their mandate is to fill the plant, to run and maximize run times, supply chain quality assurance, and regulatory compliance. And all these groups, while they might all work for the same organization and all have the organization's best interests at heart, there are natural tensions because they have different priorities. And so you have to make sure that everybody understands everything that needs to be done and all of the various aspects that need to be taken into consideration. So that said, we heard earlier about some of the issues that come up during project management. One of the big factors is corporate culture. Whether it's one company or whether it's different companies that are working together or between the company and the research firm or academic institution. Somebody talked about the red tape. So depending on what institution or what company you're talking about, culture impacts project team dynamics. If you've got a culture that is highly entrepreneurial, they're going to want to go from start to finish very quickly and get to market. Where other companies are a little more deliberate and are going to spend more time identifying where pitfalls might be, and generally what happens there is you're having to do more, or you do more reps. So you have a lot more information that is more valid. Silo mentality, because we've got misaligned goals, also come about sometimes because of the culture of the company. Resources and timelines, and I mean people, resources, pilot plant resources, whether you're going into a laboratory, and deadlines are all impacted by corporate culture. Data collection, treatment, and transparency sometimes can be a problem. Assumptions can certainly be a problem. Sometimes we think everybody understands field conditions, particularly when there's a new product or new packaging that's involved. We have to make sure that people understand the field conditions under which the product's going to be used. And then analytical methods. One group might use a different analytical method than was assumed. So general testing, making sure that those methods are spelled out. And then process knowledge. Depending on what it is that we're working on, we need to make sure that we understand variability within the process itself and what the process is capable of doing, and then, of course, communication across the groups. One of the ways we found to make sure that there is clarity before we begin a project or put the project together is putting a project charter together to provide clarity so everybody understands what's in scope, what's not in scope, all of the aspects, and we'll go through that here in a bit. There's been a lot of talk about team selection. Definitely there is, that's a big part because people are going to run the project, and then education of the project team. Technology is one that isn't talked about too much, but I'll touch briefly on that here in a little while. And then transparency. I call, within my company, we call the project sponsor the Ghostbuster. So here's the guy we're going to call in when we need to bring in the big guns, the problems that the project lead cannot solve themselves. And then flexibility. Being agile enough to make changes as the data indicates. So here's an example of a project charter that we put together way back when. This is what now, 2012. So this was a challenge study, and you can see, focus on the right-hand side, the project description. So what is it that we're trying to do? And then the business objectives and success criteria. So what does good look like? What are we trying to do? Who are the stakeholders within the company, outside of the company, any suppliers or testing expertise that we're employing? Vision, how this fits within the company or the stakeholders' vision, and then the scope of the project to make sure that there isn't scope creep if we haven't totally defined that. Any assumptions and dependencies between the groups or objectives. And then constraints. We have to make sure that those are outlined so we can get around them. Milestones certainly are important because that's how you chart how well you're doing towards completing the project. It's ideal to identify what those milestones are going to be, so they're like the next stop. Then you go on to the next set of activities. Been any business risks that need to be taken into consideration, resources, and then approvals needed. We certainly want to make sure that the project charter is versioned correctly, so as we make changes, we're documenting the revisions. Within the context of FSMA, for example, when we're putting together innovation projects, which food safety is always a part of, we look at some of the outputs. What are the deliverables? If we're making a new product, we're going to have to define the product. So the specification of the product, the process specifications, validations that need to be done, preventive controls. One of the things that some time ago really wasn't part of the innovation process, but now, at least in my company and other companies, we are forcing these to be part of the project, is standard operating procedures. So if we put a new process in a plant, we have to make sure we're training the people who are going to run the process. So standard operating procedures, work instructions, bringing personnel together, training them, educating them so they can run that process successfully. And you can look on the graphic there at all of the different aspects, and therefore these are all of the various expertises in different people that you have to bring together in order to run the project successfully to ground. Team selection becomes important. So we talked about the project sponsor. Generally, this is a senior leadership person who has the authority to make big decisions that can break down barriers as we need them. Team leader selection is one that also takes some consideration. Who can run a team that is multidisciplinary, cross-functional, that have to work together? Who are the team members that are going to be on the team, and what are their specific roles? It's helpful as we bring people together to put together a responsibility matrix so we know who's responsible for what. At the end of the day, who is actually accountable for that deliverable, who just needs to be consulted when a decision needs to be made, and then who should just be informed. One of the important factors is education of the team, because you're bringing a lot of people together that generally don't work together, but they're all going to have different roles and different in expectations. They'll have the same goals, but they'll be performing different functions, playing in the same box. Education of that group, understanding that people are all different. We have our different tendencies. We have our technical expertise, but people work in different ways. So bringing that team together to work together, to learn each other, to understand the project scope, deliverables, all of the activities. Conflict resolution, somebody mentioned earlier, what happens when you're running a project, you're running a team, but you really don't have any authority. Those people don't work for you. If there's conflict, how do you go about resolving the conflict? Maybe somebody's not pulling their weight. All these need to be defined up front, so the team leader isn't, or the project leader isn't finding themselves in a situation where it's uncharted ground or oversteps their bounds. One of the things that I think in industry anyway, I don't know if this happens in academia, we find that there are core players, okay? These are the ones I'd call the stars. Somebody, and I read this someplace, that about 30 to 40% generally of the work or collaboration within a team comes from about 3 to 5% of the people. So when you think about it, and within a company, so within companies, and actually even within industry groups, you'll find that a few people get tapped all the time to get something done. And it's a push and pull. So you have the people who are going to step up and say, me, 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 me. And then you're going to have the process owners or the groups who are going to say, you know what, we know you can do this. We know you have the ability, and so would you please? So not willing or able to say no, they take it on. So the stars end up with the lion's share of the work distribution, and sometimes you have to manage that. You have to make sure that they're not so overwhelmed that they're not functioning to a full capacity. Or they're also on other teams, and so if they happen to have a problem, they're not around, or something happens, more than one project now is affected. So we have to look at management, behavior modification, going after those stars all the time, and the stars managing their behavior and being upfront about, okay, my plate is full, I can only take so much. The fringe players, I think that was talked about earlier. The fringe players are going to be your new players. They're going to be the people who haven't built a track record. In academia, I think you call those your new investigators. So these are the new people coming into the company that really haven't made a contribution, but they're willing to help, but they kind of get overlooked. And it's because they haven't built the contribution or trust. And what we find is if these folks come in, they're energized, they want to contribute. If they're not used, leveraged, if they don't have contributions, significant contributions, within 12 to 18 months, they're gone. So it's developing those people by giving them or involving them in important projects. So engaging them when projects come along. Silos we can prevent by making sure we've got common goals that are rewarded when we achieve those goals together, as opposed to my goals and your goals and they're misaligned. External boundaries, And what I mean by that is looking at liaisons outside of the internal or the external groups and looking for changes that might affect the project itself or the outcome of the project. So if there are threats, there are opportunities that are out there, these are the people that need to bring it to the attention of the project leader or the project sponsor so they can make changes as needed. We forget sometimes to celebrate milestones, so we put those milestones out there, and people work hard at these cross-functional teams, at these large-scope projects. And when we get to those milestones, we need to stop, give them a chance to catch their breath, and get them energized, celebrate them, and get them energized for the next phase coming up. Technology, this is one that I hadn't considered actually until I was involved in a project where one group was using a completely different platform for collecting data. We couldn't see it, we couldn't even work with it. So before the project starts, choosing and agreeing on a common platform that we're going to use to manage the project, to collect data, making sure the right security is in place. Sometimes we don't have enough licenses. So you have a copy of the software and you have a copy of the software, but not everybody does. And so the entire project team doesn't have access. And what happens with that then is you're potentially going to get into noncompliance because I'm going to put my data someplace else and then come back and have the person who has the license put it in the right repository. We want to make sure when we pick software, then we are training the team members so they know how to use it appropriately. And when there is non-compliance, making sure that that is addressed right away so it doesn't fester and our data doesn't get get in a situation where the data is not transparent, people can't see it, and it's not compliant. One of the things we have to make sure also is that when we're deploying or using a new platform or software that we have capable and available IT support that can help right away and not have to, deal with voicemail. Somebody will call you back and you can't figure out how to get your data in or out or analyzed out of the platform. We talked about the Ghostbuster. No different than maybe in academia. We do have interdepartment politics that sometimes the project team by themselves cannot overcome. So here's a job for the project sponsor to break down those big walls. So interdepartment politics, resource allocation, for example, is another one where pilot plant says, I'm full, I can't run another trial, you'll have to wait until next month. Well, if your project deadline don't allow you to do that, what are you going to do? You're going to bring in your heavy hitter and have them help you get some pilot plant time. And then threats and opportunities. These are things like scope creep. Oh, we found this out. If we just tweak the project and now start looking at this other aspect, scope creep. If it's not part of the originally defined project, then you're swelling the scope of the project and in danger of maybe falling behind or running out of resources. When we have unanticipated results, then what are we going to do? Sometimes market factors or sometimes company priorities have shifted. Or you've got one of those stars on the team that had a medical and had to be gone. These are threats. Some of them are opportunities. So here's where we bring in the project sponsor, sit down, go through, make modifications as needed. And here you need a project leader who is courageous enough to go up to the sponsor and say, I think we need to make a change because ... One of the things we are beginning to do a lot of, this is something that comes out of the military, Afteraction review. So after the project is completed, doing a review, looking at what went well. Who likes surveys? You take your car to the dealer, they work on it, they're supposed to work on it anyway, and then you get a survey. That's not what this is. You don't want to send this out as a survey. You want to bring the team together. You want to do this in person. You want to go through the project. What were we supposed to do? What actually happened where we deviated or maybe had to deviate? What went well and why? So these would be strengths that we will want to capture for the next project. What needs to be improved? So we found out some weaknesses in the organization or in the way we bring teams together and work together that caused us problems. So these are ones we're going to need to elevate and actionize whatever improvements need to be done. So this is one that generally is done about 2, 3, 4 weeks after the project is finished. You don't want to wait too long where people forget. You want to, while things are fresh in their minds, bring them together and walk through, and it needs to be rigorous. So what can we do better? So this is more like capitalizing on strengths or the good things that happen, and how do we fold those into the fabric of the organization, and where do we need to make maybe policy changes that would enable us to do even better next time. So in conclusion, innovation efforts often have food safety components, and requires very close collaboration and transparency as we're going through that. As scientists, we're generally not given this kind of training, but this is something that we have to learn, we have to pick up. We generally, the stereotype of us scientists is we don't play well together, we don't like to play with other people. However, we're managing projects, and so this is something that we do need to put in our toolbox as skills and as we develop in our respective professions and careers. And with that, I thank you for your attention.